Hello, Internet people. Thanks for making it to one more session of S650 Tuning 101. Today we're going to be looking at fueling basics. I had a fun experience just now of recording about 75% of this video and then realized I was recording the wrong screen. Awesome. So we're going to take another cut. Hopefully this time will be a little more brief. This video is very in-depth. We're going to be looking at real specifics here in fueling and the S650 in particular, some of its idiosyncrasies. So let's get into it. Today, we'll be looking at closed loop and open loop, air-fuel ratio and lambda, wideband and narrowband oxygen sensors, fuel trims and the mass airflow sensor, fuel trims in the speed density model, S650, the Platypus ECU, and commanded an actual lambda as a counterpoint to fuel trims. So, closed loop and open loop. Closed loop is a state where the ECU is in a state of feedback. From one iteration in the four-stroke cycle to the next, it is measuring all of the inputs that are going into that iteration, and then the combustion event happens, and then through the miracle of oxygen sensors, the ECU can understand any byproducts left over post-combustion. And this measurement, this small delta, allows it to understand, was I 3%, 5%, 8% off in what I was hoping to see? And if so, let's add a modifier to the next cycle. If I was 3% lean, I want to be 3% richer on the next cycle, and then we'll let that cycle rip and then measure again. And if I was 0%, fantastic. If I was now 1% over, right, we can take that into account. So constant feedback the ECU is giving as it measures itself. This is possible because these ECUs are very quick. So as fast as the engine is moving at, say, 3,500 RPM, revolutions per minute, the computer is in fact faster. And as each of those cycles of the piston moving through the cylinder occurs, the ECU is ahead of the game pretty much at all times, tracking and understanding what it is the outcome of the event is. So real fast, but there are limits, which we'll get to. Here's a real world example. So if the ECU is humming along, we see that there are 8 gram-seconds of air coming in through the intake, and we're going to be looking at that more in a sec, and we can tell the RPM is stable. The ECU will command a corresponding amount of fuel to achieve a stoichiometric ratio. We'll talk more later about lambda. So this calculation occurs, right, where the air coming into the engine is known, it is metered, it is measured, we know exactly how much is there, we know the stoichiometric ratio we are shooting for. The computer can then calculate or derive the corresponding amount of fuel, and you put the two together and off they go into the cylinder, right? This is all measured, right? Open loop is very different. This is when the ECU is still performing the calculation I just outlined, but it is no longer quick enough to do the measuring and adjusting. So there are factors here, right? There's the speed of the ECU is still a thing. When we go to the wide open throttle and we're hitting RPMs of 35, 4,000, 5,500 RPM and up, that is much quicker. And not only is the ECU a limiting factor, but the sensors themselves, right, in the engine are a factor. And they can only move so quickly to produce meaningful signals that go to the ECU, which you can then mitigate. So 99% of tuning, I would say, over the past 20 years, or so, since we've had OBD2 and direct injection in particular, the tuners have had to manage closed loop and open loop very carefully. And we're going to talk more about all that in a sec. Closed loop is where you're able to do the measuring and rely on what's internal to the car, and you can do some fuel calibration with that. And then open loop is where you start to get up high in high power situations, wide open throttle, and we use different tools to account for that because the car itself cannot measure and adjust. But the S650 is different. Let's explore why. Before we get into that, though, let's do some fundamentals on AFRs and lambda. So remember in one of the early presentations in this series, we were examining stoichiometric ratio. And just as a reminder, it is this idea of I need a certain number of units of oxygen to go along with 1 unit of gasoline to get a clean burn that at the end of it there are no byproducts left over. If there is gasoline left over that was not burned, that is said to be rich. If there is oxygen left over that could have been burned but wasn't, that is considered lean. And collectively, we refer to this as our air-fuel ratio, or AFR. Okay. For 100% gasoline, the air-fuel ratio is 14.7 to 1. So I need 14.7 units of oxygen to go to 1 unit of gasoline for a clean burn. More often, in the area I live in, and probably yours as well, the gas you're finding at the pump is 90% actual gasoline, preferably 93 octane, if you're doing this for reasons we'll look at in other tutorials, 10% ethanol. And if you have this 90-10 blend, that ethanol being alcohol, of course, probably derived from corn, the AFR is 14.1 to 1, right? Not that far off. The interesting thing here, though, is that as these fuel blends can change, tracking AFRs becomes difficult. So let's throw E85 into the mix. Everybody's talking about E85, and you know they should be. If you go to an E85 pump in town, you are not going to be getting 85% ethanol out of that pump. It never happens. The law says it has to be at least 50%, and it can be up to 85%. I think the highest that people have seen in the field is something like 79%. That would be a golden pump. If you know about it, maybe you want to keep it quiet, or maybe you want to tell everybody, because that would be a magical pump, right? But the ethanol content will vary from pump to pump, day to day. And then let's imagine as well that you've got a 90-10 mix of gas in the car. You've got a quarter tank of it when you roll up to an E85 pump where you're pushing in a ratio of unknown, right? Could be 66, could be 70, could be 58% ethanol, right? And that hits gas that's already at a certain ratio, right? You can see quickly the math becomes very cumbersome, and it's a real bear. And so that AFR would be constantly drifting as the fuel composition changes, and that would be a real pain in the ass, right? So lambda is something we use. Lambda is an expression of whatever the AFR is. Let's think about the target AFR we're trying to hit, and then the stoichiometric AFR. And if I divide the two, then I get a value lambda. So for example, if I want a stoichiometric burn for ethanol blend, 10% ethanol, 14.1, that means I have a target of 14.1. The stoic is 14.1. If I divide the two, I get 1.0. That would be stoic, right? If I want to go richer than that for various reasons, let's say I want to go to a wide open throttle AFR of 12.5, which is typical for a naturally aspirated engine, then my lambda would be the 12.5 divided by 14.1, which of course is less than 1. That's how I know that my fueling ratio is rich. Conversely, if I have an air leak, if I have a problem with my intake and I'm getting unmetered air into the engine, my actual AFR, when I measure it with my logging, should be logging, right? We'll see that it was 15.5, right? Divided by 14.1, giving me a lambda that is higher than 1, say 1.06, 1.08, right? 1.11 should put the fear of God in you, right? That's way lean. And all expressed as lambda. And so this lambda becomes really important when you are, it puts every fueling conversation in an apples to apples comparison, right? And really forms the cornerstone in this world of transient fueling composition, of being able to effectively manage fuel and fueling and talk plainly across the board. So lambda, learn it, love it, use it. It's it's the accepted standard by tuners everywhere, right? I resisted Lambda at first because it's a little tricky, but for years now I've adopted it, and I assure you it is the way to go. Other things in the mix here. There are two types of oxygen sensor on modern gasoline-powered vehicles. You got your narrowbands and you got your widebands. A narrowband oxygen sensor is very quick at sending signals to the ECU. The narrowband typically sits, there are often four of them. They sit two pre-catalytic converter, two post-catalytic converter. The two pre-cat wide or narrow bands are the ones that are really used for fuel trims, and the ones following the cats are used for making sure temps and the catalytic converter are all working the way they should. And there's some magic that happens with the cat from rich to lean as it cycles through and negates all the hydrocarbons, right? The catch with narrowbands, and the reason they're called narrowband, is it can't tell you how rich or how lean you are. It'll only tell you are rich. Am I super rich or just a little bit rich, right? That's all it can tell you. And so to be able to derive fuel trim values out of this is a numbers game where that sensor is pinged continuously. So let's say over a 10 pulse period, I came in eight times out of 10 rich and the other 2 times out of 10 lean, right? So then I can use those breakdowns to derive, okay, well, I guess I was, 20% rich, or right, I'm 20%, blah, blah, blah. It all works, right? This is why the ECU does it and not me, because I'm slow and stupid at this compared to the computer. But yeah, it doesn't quantify. Wideband, very different. And I say here it's slower. It's not. Widebands are pretty quick. The difference, right, and the part of why they're so quick is because it'll actually specify, hey, I'm commanding a lambda of, let's say I'm under partial throttle. I'm commanding 0.9, right, because I'm speeding up. We'll talk about that. And the ECU comes back and says, well, based on the wideband, you're at 0.93. Right, you're 3% off. It's very specific. And that becomes important because closed loop operation relies on the narrowband O2 sensors, typically. And it pings them early and often, like I was saying, to inform the fuel trims. And then widebands are used as an augment. So two things here. Finish my thought. There's something called, I'm gonna use the concept of hunting. So if you have a car that's at idle and you turn it on and it constantly moves the idle RPM from 600 to 800 RPM, right? That's referred to as hunting. And it's the ECU moving between these various states to try and find the one that is at a stable engine. So it's not quite the same thing, but with fuel trims, it's similar in that in closed loop, we're constantly making small adjustments to the fueling, right? The more adjustments the ECU has to make, the less it is operating at the highest possible efficient power, right? So let's take a real extreme example. You've added long tube headers to the car, you have not tuned it, and the ECU over time is noting that you're about 15% off. Using this fuel trim model, it can correct the amount of fuel it's injecting to accommodate that 15% mistake. But because it's constantly accommodating for the mistake, rather than if you were just spot on, you were only 2% off, you could be making more power, right, if you were calibrated, because it's less time the ECU is correcting, hunting, moving around, right? And that's the very essence of tuning that we're doing here, right? So that's one thing. The other is typically in an open loop state, because we're not measuring and correcting, we're performing the calculations, but we're just trusting that the math we've done up to this point and that we filed away in these maps is accurate. And in order to be able to do this at all, even if you don't have a wideband sensor on the car, the classic path of the tuner begins with finding a wideband sensor aftermarket kit, getting a gauge and the sensor itself. You go to an exhaust shop and you get this thing welded in. And then you have an independent sensor for open loop that can tell you specifically what your lambda is, and you can compare the commanded and actual, right? So that's often how we have to begin. But there's a wild card here. The S650 does come with 2 wideband sensors. The 2 pre-cat sensors are wideband, and it's all baked right into the math in the ECU. The Generation IV Coyote ECU just natively works in a wideband world, and it doesn't even stop there. We'll get ready for more, but yeah, we have 2 widebands and we have 2 narrowbands. So for open loop tuning that we want to do, we could do it to our heart's content, and just file that away for a massive joke that comes on later, right? But this is normally how it works. So then we get into the world of mass airflow. So trims, everything has led up to this. There are 2 trims that we're tracking, long-term and short-term, the LTFTs and the STFTs. The short-term fuel trims, they're very immediate. They have no memory from one cycle to the next. They're just monitoring it, and they're noting whether or not it's rich or it's lean. And that qualitative, like, I'm rich, goes to the ECU. The ECU starts making adjustments based on this, and the fueling correction comes into play. Typically you'll see, if you're tight and tuned, you're going to see STFT values of 2-3%. Stock, I tend to see something like 5-6%. If something's going on, though, you might see this 10, 15, 20, right? And I think there's 25% either way, I think is like how far this thing can swing. It's pretty wide latitude. LTFTs are different from the STFTs. They do have a sort of memory, okay? So let's say the car's humming along, it's measuring, and most of the time we note that we're about 3% too lean, right? Every time the STFT comes back over, let's say, 100 cycles, 95 of those cycles it's coming back, I'm 3% too lean. The LTFT will look at that and say, you know what? Because I want to minimize that hunting behavior that I was just talking about, and I want to start getting more spot on because I can make more power, I'm just going to file away, you should 3% richen up, right? Long term, all the time, okay? And the STFT will come along and use that as a jumping off point in its calculations. So the trims will be measuring, it'll be 5% off. The LTFT will say, well, I knew you needed 3%, right? And the STFT would say, well, then I'll judge from there I need another 2, making for the 5% correction. That's how the 2 combine, right? And why did we mention the mass airflow sensor? Because the mass airflow sensor is the primary source on the intake of understanding how much metered air is coming into the engine. It knows exactly how much air is coming in. And because the Ford engineers have given us a rich, detailed model of understanding at various points of how much air is coming in, how much fuel we want to spray, we now have a very good sense of what it is we should be sending in as far as fuel. File that away. If I know how much air is coming in, I automatically know how much fuel I should send based on the model. The problem is, what if the model isn't correct? What if it's a little off? That's the whole point of the fuel trims, is because if we know the air from the math and we know the fuel, we can then measure and understand if we were off a little bit, and then we can constantly make adjustments that move us towards optimal power production. It's the whole point. Okay. Let's look at a mass airflow curve. Now we're going to get into some real shit here. So this is a very generic mass airflow curve. It is not from an S650. It's a 2-dimensional curve because we have 2 axes, right? And there are values along these axes at the points of intersection. And along the bottom here, you'll see we have voltage. So it's from 0 to 5 volts. This is DC voltage, and it corresponds to, within the mass airflow sensor, it's a little like pinhead, right? So into your airstream drops this little thin wire, which at the end of it has a little like round tip, like a pinhead, right? And as the air flows over that pin, it has a cooling effect. And the computer sends voltage into that pin, which causes it to heat up. If there's a little bit of air, I need a little bit of voltage to heat up to reach a balance point of what the temperature of the pin was before the air started flowing over it. So if I have a little bit of air, I need a little bit of voltage to heat it up to reach that point. If I have a lot of air, I need to send a lot of voltage into this little pin to reach that break point, right, of prior cooling. If I do that continuously across all known airflow states, which is here on the left, right, where I see the kilogram hours of air coming in. I prefer grams per second. We'll talk about that later. And then over here we have all our voltages, right? I know that if I'm the ECU, if from the math I'm getting this value of 3.0 volts, which comes up here, I know that I have, excuse me, on this axis, 228.3 kilogram hours of air coming in. This creates this exponential curve, and along this curve I know all these possible values, right? So that's how the ECU knows from the various different math values how much airflow is coming in. And if I know how much air is coming in, I know what? How much fuel. So let's look at a different example, and actually I'm going to come over here. So this is our S650 map. This is the tune I'm currently running. It's a fully calibrated stage 1 tune. And if you open your software and take a look, we're going to start playing with the car's brain a little here. There's these tabs across the top where various different houses of functioning are located. We're going to go to the airflow part of the house, and our sub-tabs, we have general, sped density, the electronic throttle, the infamous IMRC and variable cams, and then the force induction world, which I don't have that going on. If you do, mod stuff. If we come to general, we see a section here called math calibration. And in here we see that the S650 with its dual throttle bodies and intakes has 2 mass airflow sensors. Both of them are currently fitted, meaning they are present and working. And each of them has an airflow bank, bank 1 and bank 2. And within the airflow bank, we see, as this loads, a familiar shape, right? And that's one of the things where if you know how to tune, you can tune a lot of different vehicles if you understand the theory of what a mass airflow curve looks like. This happens to be the one on the S650, and you can see it's got this curved state, right? And along the bottom here, I have something cryptic, sent AD count. And you could see from videos early on, way before I even was doing this tutorial series, this gave me fits because understanding this is a little tricky. What it is a certain standard. The Cent standard is an SAE, I forget what it is. Oh, well, I won't try and remember here, but AD is the analog to digital, right? Something, the nibble transmission protocol, right? You don't need to know all that. Just understand that it's a little device. It's sitting on the voltage sensor, and it's sending out pings that essentially correspond to voltage. These values here from 4,000 to 15,000 are basically voltage, right? And I could add a modifying function that would make it just voltage, right? But it's a little half-baked. I don't know if the Ford engineers left it a little underbaked or it was HP tuners, because usually along the bottom here, you would see either frequency in the LT world or you would see voltage, right, in the more conventional terms. But we have some of these counts, and we have over here grams per second of airflow, and that gives us this function here on the left. Okay, and by the way, if this looks strange, if you aren't seeing this view when you open your software, it's probably because you are not on multi-view. This is the single view you get usually when you open it. You can switch between the graph and the data. I like this dual view, gives me both the graph and the data. Okay. We'll talk later about the exact structure here because this has dynamic breakpoints, but we'll wait till the math section where we do the real nuts and bolts to go through that. So that is one trims model, right? We manage and monitor our trims against the MAF sensor. The other option is speed density. We're going to talk a lot about this, but this is the intro portion. So speed density is more robust. Why is that? It is because speed density is a three-dimensional table, whereas before we only had a two-dimensional table with MAF. Speed density says I'm going to look at the air pressure in the manifold, which I'll sometimes refer to as load. Load equals air pressure, because we produce load by pressing down on the accelerator, which gets eventually to the throttle, and the throttle blades open on the manifold. And when that happens, air begins rushing into the engine, and so all this air coming in creates pressure. And so that's one thing we can measure. The other thing we can measure is the engine RPM. The two together can form should be three-dimensional lookup table. Shame on me. And the result in the cells is volumetric efficiency, which is a fancy word for understanding how much air is in the cylinder and of the possible amount of air. So the cylinder has a maximum possible amount of air that can be crammed into it. Full state would be 1.0. The zero state, of course, would be 0. And across the spread here, we often go out to hundredths. So we'll say, like, right now, the volumetric efficiency at 0.4 load, or air pressure in the manifold, and at 3,500 RPM for a clean stoichiometric burn with no byproducts and maximum power production, we know should be 0.43. How do we know that? For now, magic. The Ford engineers spent a lot of time with an engine on a bench, and they have fully mapped out this table, and they tell you with confidence you should be at 0.43 in this cell, right? Or 43% filled with air. And again, if I know how much air I need, right, I know how much fuel. And that's really interesting because check this out. This is a speed density table that comes from the Mazda speed world. And you can see here down the left side, I have load. And normally 1.0 is top atmospheric load, right? How is it that I'm going beyond that? Because I'm forced induction. I have a turbocharger. So that's why I'm accounting for manifold pressures that have a forced induction as a factor. And then across the side here, I have my RPMs, right? And that thus makes a three-dimensional table that's filled with all these values. These values are not volumetric efficiency. They are fueling targets, because I know, again, if I know the VE of a certain cell, I can know the AFR I want to command. And you can see here for low states, low load, low RPM. So if I'm cruising at low load, 1500 RPM, probably between these two cells, the computer, I want to say to it, right, go ahead and command this 14.679, which he rounded up as what? 14.7. Right, so you can tell right away we're not taking advantage of lambda here in different fuel compositions. So this tune would be limited to 93 100% gasoline. Now we can add a corrective factor. Right? Damn headphones. But yeah, we can add a corrective factor, but this is the fuel we're commanding. As we increase manifold pressure because of a throttle that we've pushed down, and because we move across here with increased rotational right of the crankshaft as the engine speeds up, we notice drops in the AFR we're commanding, and we come out here to, in this section, the hot section, right, we're seeing we go to 11.8. Here even we see we're dropping to as low as 11.167. That is hella rich. That's crazy rich. Why would I want crazy rich? Well, it just so happens in forced induction, because the heating effect from the forced induction, right, the increased pressure, the increased combustion, these engines tend to heat up a lot more. So when I send in this much fuel, I'm using most of it for the flame front and the power stroke, right? But I'm leaving a little left over deliberately, because remember I said gasoline has a wonderful cooling effect. So this leftover gas in this rich state is going to cling to the walls of the cylinder and it's going to cool it off. And that's why forced induction needs much richer commanded fuel, right? And you can see here with a speed density table like this that's accounting for all these different transient states, in real time the ECU is moving through these and commanding different fuel for different situations, all to get to, again, maximum power and the most efficient production, right? So that's one kind of speed density model. This is a fuel target-based speed density model. When we come to the LT world, this is from a Chevy, a Camaro SS V8, right? This is very different. And this is a virtual volumetric efficiency table. We see here that across one axis, we have the RPM. And over here, we have that's called the pressure ratio, which is taking the manifold pressure and adding the barometric pressure into the mix. So super exciting, right? And that it produces this grid and shape. So this is just a representation visually of a table like this one. It's just, graphed out. And there's all kinds of things to talk about with this table. But this is what it looks like. And if you think about it, every one of these curves, if you think of it as a stack of curves, right? So this is one, there's these, right? And it goes dip, 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 down the line. Every single one of these is essentially a torque curve, where it notes that as my RPM increases and as my pressure increases, I need to increase my fueling. These all happen to be volumetric efficiency based. They're not fueling, right? Because this is a world where we take lambda seriously, so we don't want to express ourselves in AFRs. That's not how it's done. We want to do volumetric efficiency, which then can convert over to a lambda calculation. But each and every one of these little intersecting lines is a volumetric efficiency value that, because I know how much air should be in the cylinder, I know how much fuel I need, right? So that's a different model. Because we're dealing with an S650, let's look at our model here. If you go to airflow, you can go to this tab, speed density, and you see a whole bunch of weird shit. Yeah, and not only that, but the concept of blow through, which is a whole other thing, right? So I'm actually going to suggest to you, don't worry about this yet. We're going to get deep into the detail on all of this. What you're really looking for is if you go up to edit, and you go to this, the speed density calculator. HP Tuners has given you this amazing tool, and we can again go to a double view here, and we can look at these values and on this table, and I see here I have a whole bunch of map points. I'm actually going to go to mapped point 10 for reasons we'll explain later. And you see here on this one side, I have my manifold absolute pressure. It happens to be in kilopascals. It's metric. It's just pressure. It's just load. Nothing scary. And once again, I have my RPMs, right? And if I graph it, and what I'm doing here is I'm using the right button on my mouse. I'm holding it down, and I'm just moving this around, which is fun, right? Your wife comes into the room, and you're touching this thing, and she's like, this is some NASA shit you're doing. Yes, it is. This is a volumetric efficiency table. It shows the load pressure, and it shows the RPM, or the manifold pressure and the RPM, and it gives volumetric efficiency number, right? You can see here it goes from 0% up to 100% volumetric efficiency theoretically. And for each and every one of these conditions, there's an intersecting node, and you can even see here over on the table as I move through this, the volumetric efficiency value that it's giving, right? And where I know VE, I know fuel. And so in real time, right, I'm idling down here, right? And I tend to go like this, right? I'm idling, partial throttle, idle, 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 throttle, idle, idle, wide open would be like up here, right? And then I come back down. That's sort of what it looks like in real time. And it very rarely would you see it just go up in one direction and up in the other, right? That's what a dyno is good for, just to say, is really isolating and moving through a specific condition, and then you can move to the next one, and then the next one, and fully map these. The way we tend to do it in the street tuning is you'll see in your logs, because you should be logging, that you will tend to move through this table in real time as you look up the fueling. That's all we're going to say for now. There's a lot more to talk about here, but that's all we're going to say for now. So getting back to this. Again, I brought it out here in relief. If I know my volumetric efficiency, which is a measure of air, because of the magic of lookups, I know what my fueling target is. This, you must understand this relationship. Okay. The Platypus ECU. So we're going to go through some things here. Everything we know about tuning goes out the window with the S650 in certain respects, and that is because of this. Ho, what is all this? He says. Okay, so I have various known tuning parameters, and then I have 3 different kinds of engines. Typically, we're talking about I could have picked others, but I picked these ones. I'm comparing an LT, a GM engine, right? So like a Camaro V8 engine, the Gen 5 GM engine. I've got the Gen 1 through 3 Coyote Mustangs, and I add an asterisk here because they're not necessarily all the same, but they have a lot of things in common. And then there's our good friend, the Gen 4 Coyote in our S650. So oxygen sensors, right? Just to compare. An LT will have 4 narrow bands, so you'd have to go get a wideband welded in. Ask me how I know. For a Gen 1 through 3, Ford has always been generous and given us 2 widebands and 2 narrowbands. Coyote is the same, 2 widebands, 2 narrowbands. Fuel trims in an LT engine tend to be MAF governed. What do I mean by that? So the engine's operating in real time, and when we are in a static state, just regular cruising along, the mass airflow sensor is what the ECU is going to look up to understand how much air came in and thus how much fuel to spray. During partial throttle, closed loop, it will still use the MAF, but it will begin using a backup calculation, which is the speed density. And so MAF and speed density can both be happening as a series of redundant checks. And in well-engineered systems, you will always have redundant checks going on. You will see later on that the torque calculators are something where we must understand this fully, because there's a lot, because the torque calculators are constantly monitoring and can clamp down at any time. But basic running around town, it's the MAF that's calculating most of the air. When we do go to open loop, that's where speed density and just watt optimal power become very important. It's enough said for now. Gen 1 through 3 Coyote were the same. Pretty much static conditions. MAF is the governor, and then for dynamic conditions, different calculations come into play. But most of the time, we're using our mass airflow sensor. The Gen 4 Coyote blows all of this away. Mysterious, uses speed density to govern its trims. Let me say that again, because this is pretty important and it's revelatory. The 4th generation Coyote is speed density fuel trim governed. So when I'm in closed loop operation and I'm just tooling around town in a static state, the speed density tables are what I'm referring to command my fueling, as opposed to the mass airflow. Now, am I still using the mass airflow? Yes. As a redundant backup check, and in different situations, I will continuously refer to it. The ECU keeps it in its pocket. But if you were to just tune the MAF on the S650 and not tune the speed density, you're not going to be tuning your fuel trims, and they will still appear to be 5, 6, 7% off across the board. Ask me how I know. So that's a big deal. It's a very big difference. And it also suggests that if you want to fully tune your S650, you're going to have to spend a lot of time with your speed density tables. How about that? If you have paid for a tune on your S650, if you dropped $800, $1,000, $1,200 to a tuner, and they then mailed you a tune that same day, and you just applied it and started running around, there's probably nothing wrong with that tune. It's probably good, but it is not speed density tuned. Just to say, right? Talk about that more later. Okay. Other things, the mass airflow sensor. When we look at how we're tuning this, it's air mass against frequency in a LT engine, and it has static breakpoints, meaning the values aren't changing. So let me, if I go back to this, I'm going to close that. I'm going to go back to airflow, general. I'll go to bank 2 this time. Okay. Come on. Oh, there we go. So when I make adjustments to this, I'm going to get different gram per second calculations, and they're going to be moving around from tune to tune. That is what I mean by that. And we'll explain more fully what that means. But the bottom line is, whereas the previous 3 generations would have just air mass gauged against voltage, and the breakpoints would be static, because the Gen 4 Coyote in its current state with the beta HP tuner software and just the way things are now, and it may change, currently, we're getting a raw analog to digital sensor count from that nibble transmission protocol. We're looking at it against air mass, and every iteration of tuning, we have to adjust for these dynamic breakpoints. It's just how we're getting around it right now. It is what it is. Other fun, interesting changes. Wide open throttle as a condition for tuning in an LT engine will tend to be open loop. The computer can't keep up. We have an external wideband sensor, and we're accounting for it in our calculations, but we know we're managing watt in an open loop state. Gen 1 through 3, same idea, open loop, right? And then the Gen 4 Coyote, though, Platypus. I run watt at closed loop. I don't think you understand the full implications of that. Let me say it again. Wide open throttle on the S650 Mustang is operated in closed loop. That is because we already have 2 wideband sensors, which I'm not even referring to because I'm speed density governed on my fuel trims. So, and then I'm also running in closed loop. So there's 2 things there. One, the S650 ECU is much faster than the S550 in previous generations. There are those who say the S650 is the S550. It's almost like S550 1.5, and this is the thing that makes it the 0.5. This is the advancement. This is what the Ford engineers went into a closed room and spent all their time doing. They said, what if we took an S550 that tends to run an open loop at watt, and it's still MAF governed? What if we make it SD governed like its cousin, the F-150, which we sell more than 10 times the amount of F-150s as we do Mustangs, and those F-150s are all speed density governed. So why are we killing ourselves making the Mustang different? Let's just do the same so we get massive economy of scale on building these engines, right? We'll make it SD governed, and with a nice, quick, fast ECU, we can keep closed loop across the board through the entire power band. And then as I idle back down, I can enter open loop and just make sure the cats and things are working, and no big deal. This is huge. And that is why I make the claim, because it's SD governed, it's harder, it's more time consuming to work on your speed density tables, but because we're in closed loop the entire time, it's very accessible to tune this engine. Because you can use fuel trims by and large for the most part. Now we still do something different at watt, but we'll get into that. So that's big. It's a very big deal. And then when it comes to how we manage volumetric efficiencies, LT engines have a very large single virtual volumetric efficiency table, which gives people fits. It's tricky. It's hard to use. If you ever really want to know more about it, I highly recommend you look up Cringer on the HP Tuners forum. He understands it probably better than anybody and spent a lot of time explaining it to me. But it's one big gangly table that is hard to work with, and we account for the camshaft's varying angles within that single table. Gen 1 through 3 Coyotes are a little more bite-sized. They break it down into a speed density calculator I showed you earlier, and it works across 26 mapped points. We're going to talk about that soon, what all that means. And there's a single optimal power table. Just to say, to complete this table, the Gen 4 Coyote still uses the same speed density calculator that HP Tuners gave us. Thank you, gentlemen, for that. Eric, Rob, everybody over there. Oh my God, thank you for the speed density calculator. And there are 28 map points, and we move instead from 1 optimal power table to 6 optimal power tables. So that will mean more later on down the road. Okay, final set of topics here. So because the S650 is a Platypus, we can use fuel trims a lot, right? More than other platforms to do a lot of our tuning, which is easier. However, fuel trim based won't work for wide open throttle, and like it does for the low and partial throttle calibration. For wide open throttle, we want to use different sensors because it's a much shorter window for logging, and we don't need the additional wideband. But the lambda error sensors will have a higher sampling rate and more reliable sampling rate than using fuel trims. This won't mean a lot to you now, just for other tuners maybe who are following along. We still have to do commanded actual calculations on our fuel trims, or to account for fueling errors up top. So just a little bit of trivia. If this doesn't mean anything to you right now, that's okay. We're going to unpack it a lot more in the future. But yes, lambda error is still used in addition to the LTFT and STFTs. Okay, that was a lot. 45 minutes. Wow. But this is the good stuff, right? This is where, if this is all very new to you, if you just went through all that and you're like, what the hell is this? Go ahead, watch it again. And again, I will encourage you to understand that I'm teaching you the theory behind all this. You don't have to use this on a Mustang, right? If you want to go tune BMWs with this knowledge, you probably can. It's just these are the specifics of this platform and HP tuners. Soon, the next time, because we covered so much in this one, you'll see I integrated fuel trims and open and closed loop all into one major package here. Next time, we're going to start talking about the high degree of freedom execution model, because that will then begin leading us into the basic tuning workflow. So that one is where we're actually going to follow the bouncing ball and begin working in software, and I'm going to show you how I tune my MAF. And then from there, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of speed density, the VCT schedule, and map points in particular, and how the HDFX moves through these schedules and map points to keep the engine running optimally, right, and all the lookups it performs. Part 2 of that will be understanding the distance tables, distance from power, and how the snap points and lines work. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because there are other folks who've done this much better than I will. I'm just going to highlight what this is and be aware of it. Then part 3, where your dear instructor has created something he calls the high-low method, and how we can tune our engine and still retain the intake manifold runner control. I have a quick and dirty video on this I produced. If you want to, just can't wait, you can go take a look at it. But this video will be in much more detail and beginner friendly. Then from there, we begin to get to preparing for power. Right? How logging, calibration, and a couple of settings we can check are going to increase the horsepower of your engine. I promise it's coming. So until then, thanks a lot and happy tuning.